Hey everybody, it's Fraser here. I hope you guys are doing well. This video is on my personal experience from football and coaching and how I developed a toolkit to maintain emotional control or an ideal mindset when you need to perform. So this video will focus mostly on sort of team sports based context, but I think this also applies to the outside world, whether that's individual pursuits or team-based pursuits. I think this is useful for a lot of people. The framework I'm going to be talking about is something I call my clear the slate concept, where essentially for the individual players or the individuals in whatever context they find themselves in, I try to get them from a coaching perspective to find their ideal mindset and be able to rebound to it. Whether something good happens, can you get back to it? If something bad happens, how fast can you get back to it? So that's kind of the concept here I'm talking about. I came across this, it's relatively common sense, but the framework I created essentially came from an insight I had when I was coaching football. For context, I played football since I was a little kid, since I was 12, 13 years old. I played in university, and once I was done that experience, my first coaching gig was with a group of 13, 14-year-old kids, maybe 30 kids on the team. 20 of the 30 had played together since they were 5 or 6, and flag football, things of that nature. So they all really knew each other really well. The coaching staff was really good. We had a whole bunch of university guys who had played university in the past who were coaching. So it was a pretty ideal scenario for this team to have success. In my first year with them, though, we were 50-50. We lost half the games, won half the games. All the games were pretty close. We weren't blowing teams out. We were average, sort of at best. But we had a lot of skillful players. So, again, learning pains. And at the time, I always thought that the success in the field was due to, if you have good coaching, like good scheme, like a good plan, and then also do you have the athletic talent to execute that plan. I thought those were the two main things you would focus on. But in one of the last games of our season, I noticed that there was sort of a third variable that I think was just as important as the first two, which was the emotional management of the individuals during their performance or during the play themselves or even during practice. And I came to that conclusion because 13, 14-year-old boys are not yet men, so they have a huge emotional swings, and you can really see that on the field. So we were playing what was probably the best team in the league at the time. It was one of our last games. And so we definitely expected to probably lose that game if we're being realistic. They were, I think, undefeated at the time. And I remember the first play they kicked off to us. We had a really good return player who caught the ball and returned it back for a touchdown. So we were up 7-0 immediately, which was unusual. First play of the game, that doesn't usually happen. And you could see everyone on our bench, on our side of the field, cheering and yelling and screaming and, chests up high, and everyone's really excited because, there's this perception of hope, right? And I looked across the field, and the other team, which again, was used to winning by a lot, was quite deflated. I could see body language was down. The coaches are, kind of upset. You can see there's tension on the other side of the field. And I thought, okay, that's good. We got some momentum on our side. Within a very short order, though, that team, who was just better coached and had better players and all the rest, slowly started to grind away at that lead. And by the second quarter, I think we were down 14-7. So they'd scored 2 touchdowns in that quarter, in the first quarter. And when they scored that second touchdown, it was very interesting for me because the dichotomy was acute. Our team was super happy, 10 minutes before or a few minutes before, and now we've just flipped roles. So as soon as they scored that second touchdown, and it became sort of obvious that maybe we probably weren't going to win this game, I looked at my kids, and they were all like, some of the kids are sitting on the bench, hands on their knees kind of thing. Kids are talking amongst themselves, but not about the game, just about what they're going to do after the game, things like that. And I could tell, ooh, man, we're going to lose. I don't even need to watch the rest of the game. Our body language indicates that we're going to get wrecked. And we did. I think we lost 47-7 or something like that. We got kicked pretty good. But in that moment, it was useful for me because I thought, the emotional management, I think we can actually control this a little bit, where we can give the kids a framework to work through that negative emotion and also the positive. So essentially, that's relatively common sense. And so in the off season, I was doing sprint coaching stuff and aerobic stuff or whatever. And as we were going through the off season, I started to implement kind of a clear the slate philosophy. So if something good happened, I'd say, oh, that's great. Next play, right? Because football's one play at a time, which is kind of nice. It makes it easy for kids to digest this. And I would just say, okay, next play, clear the slate. Next play, clear the slate. And I gave kids 30 seconds if it was positive, 15 seconds if it was negative, and 0 seconds if it was neutral. So if a good play happened, if they scored a touchdown or they did something that materially affected the game, I allowed everyone on the team, and this applies to a team as well, on the team, but also the individual, to have 30 seconds of just lose your mind. Do a handstand, wave at your girlfriend, whatever, like just go crazy, roll on the floor. I don't care what you do. But after that 30 seconds, you got to clear the slate and hit that next play at the same mindset, whatever that is to you, at the same level of intensity for the next play. And that worked really well. And this also applied to negative events. So if someone did something where, we got scored on or something bad happened, I gave you 15 seconds to cry, like call your mom, like whatever you need to do. Again, roll on the floor or whatever you need. And then after that 15 seconds, I expect that you will clear that out of your system. You'll come right back and be able to perform at the same level. So you don't let that negative instance hold you to poor performance moving forward. And you also don't let that good example or good outcome lead you to be, have hubris or overconfidence where you're going to probably have a negative outcome later on just because of your mindset. And so this applied at the team level too. If we were, if we were down point, we would go, sweet, what an opportunity to come back, clear the slate, next play. So it didn't matter if we were down 100-0 or up 100-0. I wanted the consistent performance at that peak level constantly. So of course, the first principles of this concept are that you don't control outcomes, right? You can try your best and still have a negative outcome. Doesn't matter. Clear the slate, next play, right? The second piece is that you can only control your own personal input. So let's really focus on finding like your peak performance mindset, and let's try to sit in that. And that's different for each individual, especially in the football context. Some guys scream and yell and are, vocal and overt about their intensity. And some guys are quiet and sort of, just going about their business. And so I'm more on the quiet side. But again, that's up to the individual that you're coaching or dealing with, right? Then at a team aggregate level, you also want to go, what is the response? And we do this beforehand. So we go, if we get scored on, what's going to be our response? And the kids would also sit there and go, I don't know, keep playing or whatever. And we would go, this is the response we want. You get 15 seconds to be sad about that. We're all going to clear the slate and we're going to hit the next play as an aggregate team the same. And so that's how we kind of frame that. And I implemented that sort of in the off season. And we took the same kids. I mean, obviously they were a year better because they had more coaching and development stuff, and we got new kids, and we had an athletic team. But we essentially took that framework, implemented it, and in the next year, we went undefeated and won the whole championship. And we were able to do that in a unique way to the point where, we were blowing teams out like 50, 60-0. Our defense over the season scored more points than were scored against us. And we did so well in that one season that in the town that we played for, they actually put us in the Sports Hall of Fame. Just because the numbers we were putting up were ridiculous. Roughly the same kids, roughly the same competition. The coaching was pretty much the same. The one variable that was different was that we had this mindset put in. And for little kids, that's very important. In our last championship game, we were playing against a team that had like a 14-year-old from somewhere else in the world who I don't think was 14. I think he was more like 16, 17 because he was like a foot taller than everyone. He was like a grown man, and so they weren't very well coached, but they had literally like a full-on adult playing football. He was definitely not 14, or if he was, like, I want what he's on. And so this kid was just a massive human being, and he would have given me a run for my money even when I was playing at university, I think. And so he was not dominating us because we had a good core group of players, but they actually scored first on us. So it was the equivalent scenario of the previous season. And in the season prior, I saw my whole team collapse when they realized, hey, we might not win here. And again, at this point, we're beating teams like 50, 60-0 every game. So this was an unusual circumstance for us to be in. But in this context, I actually saw the player. I looked at all the players. You could see them all going, oh, and I said, hey, clear the slate. And they were like, boom, we're on it. So we ended up winning that game. It was a bit of a dogfight by the end, and we won. And it was interesting because the other team we were playing was also undefeated the whole season. And you could see all their players start to melt as we started to have a robust defense against this particularly good player. And so that is a perfect example where the mindset, I think, actually gave us a competitive advantage, both at the individual level, but also at the aggregate team level. And then there's other examples of this where I've had personal success based on the nature of my job. I always travel or live in different areas. And so I switched cities at one point, and I was coaching a high school team, senior men. And the previous season, they went 0-8 or 0-9, or they didn't win a game the previous season. Like close, but not getting blown out necessarily, but just had bad luck with this. And when I walked onto the field, I remember like looking at some of these kids, and then we had like some monsters. Like, if you saw this team coming off the bus as the other team, you would be like, man, we're gonna have a big problem today. But for whatever reason, like they would just lose games that start at the end. And I think, again, there's like that psychological component of it. They just weren't able to maintain the run rate when adversity hit, right? So I wasn't the head coach of that team or whatever, so I started to implement, kind of my frameworks, kind of infiltrating it through the ranks. And I remember we had one particular kid, and he's playing off in university now, and he's just a monster of a player. He's 6'4", pretty jacked dude, and like he was very ideal physically for football, and had the mentality that was perfect for it too. Super aggressive and really into it. But he did a play where he kind of like messed up, and didn't have a good play, and it cost us like points or something. And he came off the field, and he had no framework for this. So he's like, tearful, upset. Coaches are saying, you got to play better, yelling at him, whatever. And he wasn't really able to process that information, and I hadn't given him the insight. So I went up to him and I was like, hey man, like, what are you doing? Like, like we need you for the next play. Like, you're one of our best players. Maybe that was true, maybe it wasn't, doesn't matter. But I was like, we need you, right? So like, clear the slate next play. And he'd never really heard that concept before, and he was a bit emotional. But after we kind of got that in, he was like, cool, like I'm gonna bring it back down to a reasonable level emotionally. I'm gonna be able to perform, and off he went. And so for the rest of the season, I kind of like sort of like, pushed that mindset into his system, and he accepted that. And by the end, he was just a Trojan. Like, bad play would happen, good play would happen. He was just like a machine out there, hammering away at it. And this actually applied to the whole team. That team went from a season where we didn't win any games to the next season. Again, great coaches, great players, but I think there's the mindset component of it. We went undefeated, won the whole thing, the championship. So everywhere I go, when I implement this, I find that the performance of the individuals, but also the team in aggregate, gets significantly better. And I think it's very common sense, but most people don't really talk about it. Often when I'm with new coaching staff, or and negative things happen in the game, even the coaches themselves, you can see panic in their eyes, or they're upset by the scenario, and this bleeds through the morale of the team. But if you watch me, I'm like, well, one play doesn't mean anything to me, whether it's good or bad. So I'm like a rock, and I'd often tell the kids I'm coaching, I was like, if you see me panic, then I give you permission to panic, right? Because again, it's like, even if you lose a game, that's not indicative of the next game even, right? So you can expand this out at the macro or as micro as you want. And I think it's extremely useful. Again, to implement this though, you have to have that conversation at the beginning. So for example, like, for quarterbacks, for example, a good quarterback will, if you threw 1,000 passes, you might complete 60% of them. So if you looked at that on like on a spreadsheet, there might be 3 or 4 passes in a row where you just don't complete the pass. Even if it's 50-50, right? There's going to be periods, like flipping a coin, where you get heads 10 times in a row. You wouldn't think that that's weird on 1,000 reps, on 1,000 on 1,000 instances of flipping the coin. You wouldn't think that that's necessarily that unusual out of 1,000. And the same thing applies with football. So for quarterbacks, for example, if you see them in practice when they're just like throwing passes one after another to receivers, like in one-on-ones or whatever, they might throw 2 bad passes in a row. And for the uninitiated into this framework, you'll see them go, oh, it's not my day. I'm having a bad day. And you can see them like starting to do that death spiral of lack of confidence. And then once you've had that conversation though, I'm like, well, it's actually not unusual to throw 3 or 4 bad passes in a row if you're throwing 30 passes in total. Like you actually shouldn't take that bad throw to mean anything for the next one, right? And vice versa. If you throw 3 or 4 hot ones in a row, you see the kids are like, oh, I'm the best. Like I'm Tom Brady out here or whatever, right? Like they're just like, I'm the best quarterback I ever lived. But I'm like, should you think that? Getting 3 or 4 passes in a row could just be luck. Like it doesn't mean anything. It's one rep at a time. Control what you can control, which is your agency in that rep. And kids, once they got that, I think were much more resilient. You can see this on the back end too, when it's like bad stuff occurring for like, let's say defensive backs. So the guys who would be defending receivers to not catch the ball. Like if you're doing one-on-one session where it's just, the quarterback, with the receiver versus one DB, like statistically, the quarterback should be completing like 70, 80% of those throws, because especially if it's Skelly where there's more than one receiver, because just by definition, like there's no pressure on the quarterback. They can wait as long as they want. It's an ideal scenario to make completions, and that's fine. It's the drill. But if you're a defensive back, often you'd see kids, they get burnt or get a pass caught on them like 2 or 3 times in a row, and you can just see their confidence melting. And I was like that too. But then once you've had this chat being like, you're going to lose 70% of the time. So like to lose 2 or 3 in a row is not even a statistical anomaly. That's just like, that's just how it's going to be, right? Like we got to like every rep, you got to compete. And as soon as they've like clicked in on that, they instantly clear this, again, and I'll actually be like, I'll like clear this, like I will yell it, I will scream it. And as soon as they ingest that or actually engage with that concept, I notice performance increases dramatically. Again, anecdotal, because it's just me as a coach looking at stuff, but I find that this even applies outside of the sporting realm. Like I worked in sales for a little bit, I worked in finance in a sort of sales environment. And I wasn't cold calling people necessarily, but I was calling people that might not necessarily know me that well, or there's like a link between us and the business, but like it was almost sort of let's just say it's cold calling. And I would find that I would hit half the time. So I'd call him like, hey, Mr. X, like I got something for you, like let's come in and talk stocks or whatever. But if I got 3 or 4 bad phone calls in a row, I could feel myself going, oh, I'm the worst at this job. I'm going to fail. I'm going to be on the street, or going down that rabbit hole, that doom loop. But of course that wasn't the case. So I applied, clear the slate, next call. Clear the slate, next client. Clear the slate, next scenario. Chewing through the work, right? Because the previous input is not going to necessarily dictate the next input, right? And this applies, even in like policing, for example. When I go call to call, often I would walk into a house and maybe I mess up. I kind of like screw up the paperwork, or someone's yelling at me. I have a negative interaction. That shouldn't follow me into the next interaction. So I would literally, as I'm leaving that call, maybe someone's yelling at me, calling me mean names or whatever, I'm feeling bad or whatever, or I'm feeling happy. It doesn't really matter one or the other. I shouldn't go into the next rep thinking I'm going to kill this, or the next rep going I'm going to like do so badly I'm having a bad day. I got to like mechanically clear that last rep, that last call, and I got to go into the new call totally fresh, compassionate, whatever, going through your whatever you got to do. So I think this applies in pretty much any person's context. I've even helped out certain athletes on the individual side in different sports who are not in a team-based environment. But again, every rep is its own unit of analysis. View things from the macro and find that ideal mindset that'll help you or the individual have your maximum performance over time. I think that skill set's super useful. I don't really see many people talking about this, specifically in football. I've coached with like dozens and dozens of coaches. Not many people talk about that this is a tool. It's kind of like common sense that you recover from in adversity, or if you are down, you come back strong or whatever. But it's not really mechanically inserted. It's not like part of your process. It just seems like it's kind of like you sort of, if you can think about it, you bring it up. But this is like part of the process. So like when I'm going to do a rep at any sport, I'm like process. This is like I'll actually say that word out loud. I'm like I'm going to find that mindset. Flick the switch, I'm in it. Nothing's going to take me out of that for more than 30 seconds at the max. And if you practice that, I think you'll have better results. So that's kind of that. I'll leave it at this. If you like this content, please subscribe. I'll do more football stuff or philosophical stuff from football as we go forward. And hopefully you guys find it useful. And if not, that's okay too. Have a great day, guys.